Let's open this up now to questions, comments from the audience.
We have one on Marshall.
Well, I know a little about it. Probably Justine can address that question better than I can. So martial law came up.
Yes, the issue with martial law in Mindanao, it was basically another manifestation of Duterte seeking to absolutize control over different areas in the Philippines. The thing with declaring martial law in Mindanao was that it was only a small city in Mindanao called Marawi that was seized by ISIS-inspired militants. But what happened was that martial law was declared all over, and there have been cases of harassment of ordinary civilians, cases of elderly and Muslim women being stripped out of their burqas because of tight inspections and checkpoints. And these are cases that we have closely monitored, and the Commission on Human Rights have also closely monitored. And situations like these really prove that the strongman tactics of President Duterte, including the war on drugs, are ways for him to unfold authoritarianism into the country. And at the same time, we have been closely monitoring developments in Mindanao, especially that martial law was declared there and was actually extended until December this year. And while martial law is declared there, we are closely monitoring with different communities, especially those that have been vulnerable, especially those that have been tagged as terrorists, for them to know and to be able to defend themselves, to be able to be informed of their civil liberties, and at the same time be able to practice and exercise their rights.
Thanks, Justine. So we had a question over here.
I live in the Philippines, and my concern is that now the war is extending to standbys. It's gone beyond drugs, and within the last month, there was a young man arrested for not having a T-shirt on him. He was outside a store. Within 2 days in prison, he was dead. And there's a law now, not a law, but there's an advisory for arresting what they called standbys, which are mainly unemployed young people. So it's a war on poverty. I'd like to know what Justine has to say on that.
Sure, and I'll just mention, maybe also coming on this, Justine, just in the last few weeks, several mayors have been gunned down in public. I don't know if it's clear that Duterte, whether or which of those Duterte is specifically behind. It certainly, at a minimum, seems to be a consequence of the situation of impunity. So, Justin, do you have thoughts on these two developments?
Yes, maybe jumping off from your point about the opportunity that is unfolding in the Philippines, especially with killings of local officials. In some way, these are also connected to how vicious the drug war in the Philippines is, especially that the spate of killings of local officials have been have been rampant, and some of these cases have been documented by security footages. I think it also unleashed a spell of fear from among citizens. There have been rumors that out of the fears of deaths and killings of local officials, martial law may be declared nationwide. And at the same time, whenever some local official gets killed, Duterte comes on air after in public television and accuses these local officials of being involved in the drug trade. And so these are developments that we think are tactics to unfold fear into the whole population in order to justify declaring martial law and really attacking authoritarianism in the country.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Levi Bautista. I represent the United Methodist Church at the United Nations. Thank you very much for the speakers. I think as a church person, let me put some context. In the last 6 months, an Episcopal Anglican-related bishop was detained by the Duterte government. 2 Roman Catholic priests were executed at the time when they were preparing for Mass. 3 United Methodist missionaries were expelled by the Duterte government. Just about a few days ago, a missionary, United Methodist missionary from Malawi, 3 of them assigned in Mindanao at the In Peace, which is an organization related with the peace process. I think part of the context of the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines must be taken note of, which is the criminalization of poverty and the criminalization of political acts. In other words, there is in fact an ongoing insurgency in the Philippines, and the drug war provides for a cover for political killings. And I think that should not be forgotten, that in fact, the assault on the poor is an assault on the base of political organizing. And therefore, the pretext for the killing of many of the poor people, being people who are drug addicts or related to the drug trade, is a pretext for quashing, decimating a base for political organizing within democratic forces in the Philippines. So, but the larger context of that is that the democratic institutions have been so decimated owing way back to the Marcos dictatorship, and therefore the assault on the judiciary and the legislature, the co-optation of both institutions by the executive, by the Duterte government, has therefore imperiled, I should say, political dissent. And so extrajudicial killing, detention, arbitrary arrest and detention are not just on the rise, but have been steadily happening even all the way back to martial law. The fourth item I think that should not be forgotten is the patronage of the US government of the Philippine government. And that connects Mr. Duterte with Mr. Trump, the 2 administrations. And we need to connect, for example, this discussion with the high-level political forum, perhaps with the Agenda 2030, which should be, and in relation to the US government, the US support for what is called the Millennium Fund, Millennium Challenge Fund, and the support for the military in the Philippines must be attached. Lastly, I think it was important for our resource persons to mention the situation of Mindanao and why martial law in Mindanao. Martial law in Mindanao provides for the context of what Mr. Duterte wants the Philippine Constitution to be changed to change the republic into a federal government. So the federalization of the Philippines provides for an easy control of political and economic warlords of specific territories, Mindanao being Mr. Duterte's area. So those should not be lost in the conversation, albeit we're zeroing in on this on the drug war. The context, the economic and political context of the Philippines, and the complicity of the U.S. with its economy and with its politics should always be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Good question.
Oh, sure.
I'm just curious, what will it take before there can be sanctions coming from governments from the EU, maybe not from the United States, given the situation that we have in the Philippines? You mentioned that, yes, there is an ongoing case in the International Court of Justice, in the ICC, even if the president has mentioned that the country is withdrawing from the treaty, but that should not exempt whatever findings there would be related to his alleged crime against humanity. So you mentioned the reimposition of the death penalty as a possible issue that can prompt governments to withdraw or to impose some sanctions against the Philippine government. But maybe the government so I don't know what sanctions would be possible given the situations we have now in the Philippines, given the UPR, I think, that has findings related to extrajudicial killing of the Philippines, and the many reports related to that situation. So I would like to see any legal sanctions coming from the international community and from specific countries related to the situation in the Philippines.
We've done some work on this last November, coinciding with the ASEAN summit. We organized a sign-on statement calling for human rights conditions on some types of aid to the Philippines. But we were talking mainly about law enforcement, drug law, as opposed to trade sanctions, and not even all law enforcement assistance, because some of it, we hope, some of the training helps professionalization and can reduce abuses. But there's a language in the U.S. Senate that has a pretty good chance of becoming law that would restrict funding for the Philippine drug war, and requires an evaluation by the State Department. Now, I know that officials, and certainly in the EU, they are careful about this because they don't want to end up harming regular Filipinos, especially if that does not then lead to steps by the government to produce reforms. And so the trade sanctions, the loss of duty-free status, for example, they're not in a rush to go there for that reason. Maybe there are other reasons too, their own business and economic interests. I can only speculate. But the death penalty is, there's an established standard having the death penalty in law. But we do feel that governments, especially donor governments, should be applying whatever pressure they can, doing so carefully. But it's international sanctions are complex matters, especially given what sanctions do to regular people. So it's something that's there. I tend to think international pressure is probably more likely to work in effect in the Philippines through impacting on the dialogue there than and by providing encouragement and support that helps the opposition. That's kind of what it looks like to me. But I wouldn't want the possibility to be removed, and we do think drug war funding and cooperation, that restrictions on that should definitely be on the table. Any thoughts on this area?
Well, at least within the United States, there's something called the leaky law that prevents U.S. funding to go towards any foreign group that commits widespread human rights abuses. So I don't know if part of that current bill also embraces some of those considerations, and that the hook is in fact that there is knowledge that these state forces are committing systemic human rights abuses, and therefore at least no Department of Defense funding should be used to advance any state security interests in the Philippines on that basis. So that might be an appropriate avenue of advocacy.
Yeah, well, I think it is being looked at in Leahy vetting, and I think the State Department did restrict some of this support. And Senator Trillanes in the Philippines has raised the question of whether the Magnitsky Act could play a role as well. I haven't studied up on that act. So.
Right. I don't think that's ever been used. It's not for prosecution. But I think it's a good idea, certainly to think about the European Union. I know in the matter that I'm working on Libya, the EU is engaged in that. Certainly not to engage in sanctions, but they are investigating the situation and they're eager to have more information. Some of that may be self-interested, though, because certain members of the EU do support Libya. Current sort of, they support one side. Some countries support one side in the civil war there. So it's, I don't really know enough about European politics to know whether some countries may be supportive of the Philippines or not, and to guard its policies. But certainly, I think any information that you sort of write the EU and request that they take a look at the matter if they're not already doing that.
I also, I was going to say.
Just to add,
Oh, go ahead, then.
aside from the International Criminal Court preliminary examination of the killings and the review of the GSP Plus status, which is a trade agreement between the EU and the Philippines, there have also been overwhelming calls from the UN Human Rights Council for the Philippines to accept an independent and impartial investigation from the Special Rapporteur on some executions, and that's SR Agnes Calamar. But there have been resistance from the Duterte government. The Duterte government has requested conditions from Ms. Calamar before she can step into the Philippines, and that involves that after the investigation, after the probe, there will be a national debate on television between President Duterte and Ms. Agnes Calamar, to which would compromise the integrity of Ms. Calamar's report. So, understandably, she will have to refuse the conditions of President Duterte. So, the calls of the UN Human Rights Council last month and different human rights organizations and opposition figures here in the Philippines is for the Philippine government to finally accept an independent and impartial probe on the killings from the United Nations.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that there was a statement made by a group of countries on at the Human Rights Council. I believe that's happened 2 sessions in a row now. It's actually organized by Iceland, which turns out is taking the U.S.'s place on the Human Rights Council since we withdrew from it. Costs and benefits. Did you have a question?
Since we're talking about options to address this issue, maybe I would just like to maybe broaden a little bit the discussion, because we are talking about extrajudicial killings only in context of authoritarianism. And then we have the examples of Indonesia and Philippines, which becomes very clear to the public what's happening there, especially because you have this very strong linkage with authoritarianism. And well, because some of us mentioned the war on poverty as well, I would just like to bring to the discussion and hear perhaps some thoughts on linkage between extrajudicial killings in the war on drugs in context of very well established democracies, for example, countries in South America where this is such an excuse for police to enforce violence and cause deaths of children and families and everyone involved in the context and places and settings where allegedly drug crimes are taking place. And yeah, just to bring that up as well, because sometimes we talk only of authoritarianism in this context, and it I feel like we undermine and forget these other contexts where governments are not authoritarian in any other sense in their governance, but they are very much when we're talking on drugs. And yeah, I just wanted to hear maybe from Justine and the other colleagues from Philippines here as well, if you have been in contact with movements, social movements in these other countries who face similar issues but are not that much in the spotlights just because it's part of their poverty context and has been forever throughout the different governments as a practice.
Sure. Any thoughts from either of you on this?
Well, I think the earlier comment about basically being a tool of political oppression and the war on poverty, as we've heard as well, is spot on. It doesn't require authoritarianism in order for politicians and state actors to engage in extrajudicial killings for their own political purposes. So I think that's absolutely right. As being a way in which the populace is also being desensitized through the acts of these particular leaders. So I think that's a subtle variation, but certainly it's been around for quite some time. We're disenfranchised, continue to be disenfranchised through a variety of means, to include, unfortunately, extrajudicial killings.
Other types of extrajudicial violence are part of this as well. A minister in Turkey, I believe it was, called for breaking drug dealers, drug traffickers' legs. President Trump, I don't think, I haven't seen, I don't know that this had an immediate impact on police, as you mentioned. Specifically what he urged police to do, and he was speaking to a large group of police on Long Island, was to bash suspects' heads on car door frames when arresting them. Police have a procedure of using their own arms to prevent the suspect's head from hitting the car door frame, and Trump suggested not doing that. Not sure he was talking about drug cases. So yeah, I think we should certainly. I'd like to learn more about these kinds of problems as they're happening in other countries as well. It all deserves focus. Do we have more questions? Oh, so Justine.
Just a comment on that. I think also the reason why the dentist drug war rests on the foundation of failed drug reform policies even before the Duterte administration. So even before the rehabilitation services for people dependent on drugs have been poor and lacking and inadequate. And the concept of harm reduction isn't as developed here in the Philippines. And yes, that's also the reason why Duterte's narrative of killing people who abuse drugs is so strong because it rests on years and years of failed drug policies, of years of stigmatizing drug use, and years of failed health services, inadequate health responses for people who are dependent on drug use.
So we had a question this side.
My name is Karen Taylor, and I'm with the Congregation Family. And one of our main missions is to end street homelessness. And I see a definite connection between the war on drugs and SDG 11, which is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So I'm wondering if you, maybe Justin, or even if there are legal ramifications that are contributing to street homelessness in the Philippines or in other areas that have the drug wars waging currently.
Well, I can address that as a lawyer. One of the great criticisms that I can offer of international human rights law is that it's terrifically positivistic for the most part. And terrifically, I'm being a bit facetious. A lot of lawyers think that they can solve problems by creating more laws. And for the field practitioners in the room, that's not the case. To end things like homelessness, you need to work on development and capacity building more than anything. And so my perspective on the greatest way to achieve change when it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights is really through development, through capacity building. I think that certainly there are certain provisions of international human rights law that are violated when individuals aren't afforded adequate safety and security and the like. And there are various means of legal redress, either domestically if the country has some domestic legislation that allows for civil rights suits or some type of punitive sanction against individuals who deny access. Think about landlord-tenant rights here in the United States, public housing as it may be. So we do, even though the United States has its problems, we do sort of have some degree of enforcement mechanisms for individuals who have been disenfranchised through tenant rights, for example. Of course, through other legal mechanisms, you have various regional human rights bodies that do exist that can help frame international legal rights, and of course, international bodies as well. We talked about the Human Rights Committee. There's International Court of Justice for state adjudications, and the like. But I think to solve this particular problem of extreme poverty and homelessness, it's passing other laws not going to really help. It's going to be capacity building and the sustainable development goals that are so important. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but bottom line is that laws aren't going to do it. It's my response.
I'd agree that addressing these problems, poverty, homelessness, long term, should have some impact in reducing support for approaches like extrajudicial killings. I think it's worth noting, Duterte was the mayor of Davao for major city on Mindanao Island for 20 years, with some brief interruptions during that because of term limits. And by his own admission, he operated a death squad, the Davao death squad, and street children were among their most common targets.
I just wanted to add, again, for context, the Philippines is also a sensitive state. So a lot of the production is from farms because it's mostly agricultural land. And so with this idea of poverty and of homelessness, there's actually the issue of landlessness. So people who are farmers and peasants who are working the land don't own the land. And you see corporations coming into places like Mindanao where the resources are so rich and the land is so rich, and corporations coming in to take over that. And so the fight between indigenous folks and folks who've been trying to own their land and live off of their land and not exploit their land is the reason that there's homelessness, that there are thousands of people who are being displaced. The Lumad have been again evacuated from their schools. They're in these gymnasiums, in these auditoriums, seeking refuge because of military presence trying to take over their land. And so I think looking at homelessness and folks who are on the street is really bringing that back to why aren't they owning land. And so it's the solution can't be other people coming in and paying for the land and then giving it to them, right? It's allowing the people to actually own their land that they live on and that they live off of, again, because of the semi-feudal agricultural state of the Philippines. And so I think just remembering that also when asking or thinking about why there is homelessness.
So Lumad, by the way, is a term for the many different indigenous groups in the Philippines, or correct, it's for the Christian or non-Muslim indigenous peoples, and Moro is the Muslim indigenous. Are there any questions, comments?
Just to add on the issue of solving poverty in order to end the war on drugs, the data from the Drug Archive also supports the fact that the war on drugs is a war on the poor. According to the data, most of the victims are male, are poor, and have also been accused of fighting back and shooting back at the police, and that's why they were killed out of self-defense by the police. But what's important to note is that the highest concentration of killings in Duterte's drug war happened in Caloocan and in Metro Manila, especially in urban poor and depressed communities, where people have basically no jobs and have no safe communities and places and homes to live in, and they become prey to this drug war, wherein the police have basically been turned into killing machines, where police officers, according to some reports, have been given quotas on how many they can capture per night. So some of the solutions really to end the drug war in the Philippines is to fix long-term problems of poverty and at the same time shift the focus of the government's policy on how they solve drug dependency. That is by providing them rehabilitation when they need it, and also destigmatizing the use of drugs here in the Philippines.
A question for Justine. Just to kind of go off on what you said about it being a class war against our people, and also that the past administrations should also be held accountable to what has happened, because as much as we keep on talking about Duterte, there's a lot of other people that we are not holding accountable from previous administrations, because this didn't just happen overnight, right? This has been an ongoing struggle in the Philippines. Poverty has been an ongoing struggle in the Philippines. So I think how can we start how are you able to start shifting power from talking about the president, but actually talking about the people and organizing work in the Philippines? So I think that's my question, is around how Akbayan youth have been doing that work locally with young people, and maybe also some of the adults in the Philippines.
I'm not sure I I got the last words or the questions.
So, like how, like what kind of organizing work have Akbayan youth been doing to shift that mentality of just talking about Duterte, but actually looking at it in a bigger picture of like previous administrations are also responsible for what has happened in the Philippines. Because Duterte is just like we're talking about him because he's very explicit on the things that he says, and he's also very like machismo. So now it's like how are you like how has Akbayan youth been shifting like conversations with like for example like Duterte supporters? Like how are you able to engage them and actually start changing their views, right? Not changing their views, but kind of like seeing our view of like what the drug war is.
Akbayan youth is organizing young people, especially that a lot of them are will be voting in the polls, and at the same time, a lot of them are mobilizable forces in order to stand for justice and human rights, and really stand up and defend for the rights of the families who are victimized by the drug war killings. This July, we are training young village council leaders who will be faced with different problems related to drugs in their communities to adopt a harm reduction approach, and for them to be able to identify some of the health services issues that could be used in order to alleviate some of the sufferings or why there are problems related to drugs in their communities in the first place. At the same time, we have been educating people on human rights and going out to communities in order to provide justice and support the families victimized by the drug war.
So with that, I think we are out of time for a rental of this room. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Justin, for staying up till 2 in the morning to join us. If you haven't already and would like to, we have sign-in sheets on the back table on your way out. We also have some StopTheDrugWar.org stickers. Welcome to as many as you would like. And more about our work on this issue can be found at StopTheDrugWar.org/Philippines and StopTheDrugWar.org/global. Thank you.
I just make an announcement.
Oh, sure, and okay.
If there are any of you who would be interested in meeting the United Nations Special Rapporteur of Internally Displaced Populations, who is a Filipino, who is based in Mindanao, Cecilia Jimenez, she's the Special Rapporteur. I'm organizing a small meeting with her. She used to work with me in the Philippines in the 1980s, but she requested me to organize a small group. Will you please give me your name and your email address? It will have to be limited to 20 people, and I'll be sending an Eventbrite discussion. It's either tomorrow late afternoon or brunch in the morning of Wednesday. But she's here speaking at the UN, but she requested me to meet with other people if I could organize one.
How do we contact you? What's reading? How can we contact? I'm sorry. How can we contact you? What's reading? Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.